War crimes, the two words that represent humanity's darkest capabilities. Throughout history, soldiers and leaders have crossed lines that shouldn't exist, committing acts so heinous they defy comprehension. This isn't just a list of historical footnotes. This is a journey through the moments when warfare abandoned all rules and humanity itself became the casualty. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The concept of war crimes is relatively new. For most of human history, there were no rules. Armies did whatever they wanted to, whoever they wanted, and nobody batted an eye. The strong conquered the weak, and that was that. But as warfare evolved and became more destructive, something had to change. The first real attempt at creating laws of war came in 1864 with the Geneva Convention. Yeah, there's more than one, but this was the original. It focused on protecting wounded soldiers and medical personnel. Sounds basic, right? But before this, injured soldiers were often killed where they lay or left to die slowly. Medical tents were fair game for attack. The Geneva Convention said no more. These people are off limits. But here's where it gets interesting. Creating rules and actually following them are two completely different things. The moment that ink dried on the Geneva Convention, nations immediately started figuring out how to work around it. It's like when your parents make a new house rule and you spend the next week finding every possible loophole. Except, with significantly higher stakes. World War I showed everyone just how creative humans could get with cruelty. This was the first major conflict after international laws of war were established, and it became a testing ground for just how far those laws could bend before breaking. Trench warfare created a nightmare scenario where soldiers lived in mud for months, watching their friends die from disease, artillery, and poison gas. That's right, poison gas. Chlorine, mustard gas, phosgene. These weapons caused some of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. Your lungs would fill with fluid, and you'd essentially drown in your own body. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 had banned poison weapons, but multiple countries used them anyway. Germany introduced chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, killing thousands. Then everyone else decided if Germany was doing it, they might as well too. But poison gas was just the beginning. The treatment of prisoners during World War I revealed something disturbing about human nature. When you dehumanize your enemy enough, when propaganda convinces you they're monsters rather than people, you can justify almost anything. Prisoners were starved, worked to death, and executed for minor infractions. The Ottoman Empire took this to an extreme that still echoes today. The Armenian genocide happened during World War I, and it remains one of history's most horrific mass killings. Between 1915 and 1923, the Ottoman government systematically murdered approximately 1.5 million Armenians. This wasn't collateral damage from warfare. This was deliberate extermination. Armenians were marched into the Syrian desert without food or water. Those who collapsed were shot. Women and children were kidnapped or killed. Entire villages were burned. The scale of planning required for something like this is terrifying. This wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of violence. This was organized, bureaucratic genocide. And the world barely reacted. Some nations condemned it, sure, but nobody intervened. Nobody stopped it. This set a dangerous precedent that would haunt the next few decades. If you could murder over 1 million people and face no real consequences, what was stopping the next person from trying? You probably know where this is heading. World War II makes everything else look like a warm-up act. The sheer scale of atrocities committed between 1939 and 1945 is almost incomprehensible. We're talking about a conflict where the death toll reached somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. Let me put that in perspective. If you counted one number per second without stopping, it would take you over 2 years to count to 70 million. That's how many lives were ended. The Holocaust stands as perhaps the most systematic and industrial approach to mass murder ever conceived. Nazi Germany didn't just kill Jewish people along with Roma, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and political opponents. They created an entire infrastructure designed for efficient extermination. Concentration camps, gas chambers, crematoriums. They kept meticulous records. They experimented on living human beings. Joseph Mengele performed surgeries without anesthesia on children. Unit 731 in Japan conducted biological warfare experiments on prisoners that included vivisection, forced infections, and testing grenades on living people at various distances. These weren't rogue soldiers acting on impulse. These were organized programs with budgets, staff, and goals. That's what makes them so uniquely horrifying. Someone sat in an office and calculated how many people could be killed per day with maximum efficiency. But World War II's war crimes extended far beyond the concentration camps. The bombing campaigns against civilian populations represented a shift in how warfare was conducted. Cities became legitimate targets. Dresden, Germany, was firebombed so intensely that the resulting firestorm created winds strong enough to uproot trees and suck people into the flames. Estimates suggest 25,000 people died in 2 days. Hamburg suffered a similar fate earlier in the war. Tokyo was firebombed with incendiary weapons designed specifically to destroy the city's wooden buildings. Over 100,000 people died in a single night. Then came the atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The debate about whether dropping these bombs was necessary still rages today, but there's no debate about the result. Instant vaporization for those closest to ground zero. Severe burns and radiation poisoning for those further out. Long-term cancer and genetic damage for survivors. The bombs killed somewhere between 130,000 and 226,000 people, most of them civilians. After World War II ended, something unprecedented happened. The Nuremberg trials brought Nazi leaders to justice for crimes against humanity. This was the first time in history that military and political leaders were held accountable on an international stage for their actions during war. The phrase, "just following orders," was established as not being a valid defense. You couldn't escape responsibility by claiming someone above you made the decision. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Justice was selective. The Allied powers committed their own war crimes during the conflict. Soviet troops raped an estimated 2 million German women during their advance into Germany. Japanese prisoners of war were sometimes executed rather than properly detained by American forces. British and American bombing campaigns deliberately targeted civilian areas. None of the Allied leaders faced trial for these actions. The winners wrote the rules and judged the losers. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the Cold War. Korea, Vietnam, countless proxy conflicts across Africa, South America, and Asia. Each brought new horrors and new methods of inflicting suffering. Napalm turned human beings into living torches. Agent Orange poisoned entire ecosystems and caused birth defects that still appear today. The My Lai massacre saw American soldiers murder over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including children and elderly people. Some of the victims were sexually assaulted before being killed. Chemical weapons kept appearing despite being banned. Iraq used them against Iran during their war in the 1980s. Saddam Hussein then used them against Kurdish civilians in Halabja, killing about 5,000 people in a single day. The attack used mustard gas and nerve agents. People died in their homes, in the streets, trying to flee. Photos from the aftermath show parents clutching their children, all dead from invisible poison. The Balkans in the 1990s proved that genocide wasn't something confined to history books. It could happen in modern Europe with the world watching. The siege of Sarajevo lasted nearly 4 years. Snipers deliberately targeted civilians, including children. The Srebrenica massacre in 1995 saw Bosnian Serb forces systematically murder over 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys. They were separated from women and children, taken to execution sites and shot. Mass graves were dug with bulldozers. Some victims were buried alive. Rwanda descended into hell that same decade. In just 100 days during 1994, approximately 800,000 people were murdered in a genocide that moved faster than the Holocaust. Hutu extremists killed Tutsis and moderate Hutus using machetes, clubs, and any weapon available. Neighbors killed neighbors. Teachers killed students. The speed and intimacy of the violence made it uniquely horrific. This wasn't industrial killing at a distance. This was face-to-face murder on a massive scale. Radio broadcasts encouraged the killings, calling Tutsis cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. The international community's response? Essentially nothing. The United Nations had peacekeepers in Rwanda who were ordered not to intervene. They watched the genocide unfold and did nothing because their rules of engagement didn't allow action. Those peacekeepers have to live with that memory forever. Moving into the 21st century, you'd think we'd have learned something. You'd be wrong. The War on Terror introduced new categories of war crimes and new debates about what counts as torture. Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq became synonymous with prisoner abuse after photos emerged showing American soldiers humiliating and torturing detainees. Waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation. The debate about whether these constitute torture misses a crucial point. The Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibit humiliating and degrading treatment of prisoners, regardless of whether you call it torture. Syria has become a showcase of modern war crimes, chemical weapons used against civilians multiple times, barrel bombs dropped on hospitals and schools, systematic torture in government prisons. The Assad regime has killed hundreds of thousands of its own citizens. ISIS committed mass executions, sexual slavery, and cultural destruction. They filmed themselves beheading prisoners and destroying ancient historical sites. Russia's involvement brought indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. But perhaps nothing in recent years has been as well documented as what's happening right now across various conflicts worldwide. Technology has changed everything. Everyone has a camera. Satellite imagery can track troop movements. War crimes that once would have been hidden are now broadcast in real time. Yet somehow this hasn't stopped them from happening. The International Criminal Court exists to prosecute war crimes, but it faces a fundamental problem. It can only prosecute individuals from countries that recognize its authority. The United States, Russia, China, and India aren't members. This means the court can prosecute leaders from smaller nations, but has no power over major powers. Justice remains selective, applied to the weak, but not the strong. And that brings us to a disturbing realization about human nature and conflict. We've established laws, created courts, and written conventions. We've said never again after every major atrocity. Yet war crimes keep happening. They're not aberrations or exceptions. They're a consistent feature of human conflict across every era, every culture, every ideology. The question isn't whether war crimes will happen in the next major conflict. History suggests they absolutely will. The question is what form they'll take and whether anyone will face consequences. Because if there's one lesson from this blood-soaked history, it's that creating rules is easy. Following them when it's inconvenient? That's where humanity repeatedly fails. So what makes someone commit a war crime? Why do ordinary people become monsters when given power over others during conflict? The psychology behind this is darker and more uncomfortable than most people want to acknowledge, because it suggests that under the right circumstances, almost anyone could do it. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s showed something terrifying. When an authority figure in a lab coat told ordinary people to administer what they believed were lethal electric shocks to strangers, 65% went all the way. They continued even when the person was screaming in agony. These weren't sadists or psychopaths. They were normal people following orders. Sound familiar? That's because every war criminal ever prosecuted has used the exact same defense. I was just following orders. The Stanford prison experiment took this further. College students were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners in a mock prison. Within days, the guards became abusive and cruel. The experiment had to be shut down early because the psychological damage was getting too severe. What happened? Nothing except a change in environment and the assignment of roles. That was enough to transform regular students into people who enjoyed inflicting suffering. Philip Zimbardo, who ran that experiment, later testified as an expert witness about Abu Ghraib. His conclusion? The soldiers who committed abuses weren't bad apples. They were normal people placed in a toxic situation with inadequate oversight and vague rules about acceptable treatment of prisoners. The military court disagreed and prosecuted them anyway. But his point stands. Context matters enormously. War itself creates the perfect conditions for atrocities. You're in constant danger. Your friends are dying. You're exhausted, scared, and angry. The enemy has been dehumanized through training and propaganda. You're not killing people anymore. You're eliminating threats or targets or hostiles. Language matters. It creates psychological distance. Then there's moral licensing. Once you've killed enemy soldiers in combat, which is legal, the psychological barrier to killing civilians becomes lower. You've already crossed the line of taking human life. Going further doesn't feel like as big a step. Each atrocity makes the next one easier. It's a slippery slope that's been documented in conflict after conflict. Group dynamics amplify everything. If everyone around you is committing atrocities, not participating makes you the outsider. Soldiers who refuse to participate in war crimes often face retaliation from their own units. They're seen as weak, disloyal, or dangerous. The social pressure to conform is immense. You either participate or you're against your own side. Revenge plays a massive role. When your unit suffers casualties from an IED planted by insurgents hiding among civilians, the temptation to retaliate against those civilians is overwhelming. It doesn't matter that they might be innocent. Someone needs to pay. This cycle of revenge and counter-revenge has fueled conflicts for generations. Each side remembers their own victimization while minimizing or forgetting their own atrocities. Ideology provides justification. If you genuinely believe the enemy represents an existential threat to everything you value, extreme measures feel justified. The Nazis believed Jews were destroying Germany. Hutu extremists believed Tutsis were oppressing them. ISIS believed they were fulfilling divine will. American soldiers were told they were fighting terrorism and protecting freedom. When you're convinced you're fighting pure evil, normal moral constraints feel like unnecessary handicaps. Distance makes killing easier. Dropping bombs from 30,000 feet is psychologically different from shooting someone face to face. Drone operators experience PTSD despite being thousands of miles from the battlefield. But the act of killing feels more like a video game in the moment. This psychological distance enables industrial-scale killing that would be impossible if every death required personal confrontation. But here's what makes this really disturbing. War crimes aren't always committed by people who've lost control or snapped under pressure. Many are calculated and systematic. The Holocaust required massive bureaucratic coordination. Rwanda's genocide was organized through radio broadcasts and local officials. Assad's torture prisons operate with medical staff to keep victims alive for more interrogation. These aren't crimes of passion. They're planned operations. Sexual violence in war deserves special attention because it's so consistently used as a weapon. In Bosnia, rape camps were established specifically to terrorize and humiliate. In Rwanda, Sexual violence was systematic. ISIS captured women specifically for sexual slavery. This isn't about desire or loss of control. It's about power, humiliation, and destroying communities. When you rape someone's daughter or wife in front of them, you're sending a message about who has power and who is helpless. The use of child soldiers represents another category of war crime that's particularly insidious. Armed groups abduct children, sometimes as young as 8 or 9, and force them to fight. These children are given weapons, drugs, and told to kill. They're both victims and perpetrators. What happens to a child's development when they're forced to murder before they've finished elementary school? Many child soldiers end up committing atrocities because they've been systematically brutalized and indoctrinated. Technology is changing war crimes in ways we're still figuring out. Cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure could be war crimes. If you hack a hospital's systems and people die because medical equipment stops working, is that different from bombing the hospital? Autonomous weapons that select and engage targets without human intervention raise questions about responsibility. If an AI commits a war crime, who gets prosecuted? Social media has become a tool for both committing and documenting war crimes. ISIS used it to recruit and terrorize, but activists use it to expose atrocities in real time. The Syrian conflict is probably the most documented war in history. Yet all that documentation hasn't stopped the crimes or led to many prosecutions. Awareness doesn't equal action. There's also the problem of collective punishment, which is explicitly illegal but happens constantly. When insurgents operate from a village, the entire village gets punished. When a terrorist comes from a certain ethnic group, that entire group faces retaliation. This creates cycles of violence because collective punishment inevitably creates new enemies. You kill someone's innocent family member, and congratulations, you've just created someone with a legitimate grievance who might seek revenge. The erosion of distinctions between combatants and civilians has made modern warfare particularly dangerous for non-fighters. Insurgencies and terrorism deliberately blur these lines. Fighters hide among civilians. They don't wear uniforms. They store weapons in homes and schools. This doesn't justify attacking civilians, but it makes the situation more complex. When everyone could potentially be an enemy, the temptation to treat everyone as one increases. Economic incentives drive some war crimes. Looting has always been part of war, but in some conflicts, it's the primary motivation. Militias in the Democratic Republic of Congo fight over mineral resources. They commit atrocities to control territory, not for ideological reasons, but for profit. When war becomes a business, atrocities become business decisions. Terrorizing a population into fleeing makes it easier to control resources. Then there's the bureaucratic banality of evil that Hannah Arendt identified. Many people who enable war crimes never personally commit violence. They just process paperwork, drive trucks, or follow procedures. The person who schedules trains to concentration camps isn't personally killing anyone, but the trains don't run without them. This diffusion of responsibility allows people to participate in atrocities while maintaining psychological distance from the outcomes. Command responsibility is supposed to address this. Military commanders are responsible for crimes committed by their subordinates if they knew or should have known and failed to prevent or punish them. But this is incredibly difficult to prove. Commanders can claim ignorance. They can say they gave orders that were misunderstood. The chain of responsibility gets murky. What about soldiers who refuse to commit war crimes? They exist, but face serious consequences. Hugh Thompson was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam who stopped the My Lai massacre by threatening to shoot American soldiers if they didn't stop killing civilians. He was ostracized for years and only received recognition decades later. Most soldiers who refuse to participate don't become heroes. They face courts-martial, imprisonment, or violence from their own side. The privatization of military functions has created new accountability problems. Private military contractors have committed abuses in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they're not subject to military justice. Prosecuting them under civilian law is complicated. Some operate in legal gray zones where nobody has clear jurisdiction. When a contractor commits a war crime, who's responsible? The company? The country that hired them? The individual? Medical professionals who participate in torture or other crimes face unique moral failures. Doctors who keep torture victims alive so interrogation can continue. Psychologists who design enhanced interrogation techniques. Medical staff who falsify death certificates to hide executions. These people have sworn oaths to do no harm, yet they enable some of the worst abuses. Their betrayal of professional ethics makes their participation particularly disturbing. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Many war criminals return home and live normal lives. They become teachers, shopkeepers, neighbors. They raise families and participate in communities. The person serving you coffee might have participated in genocide. This isn't speculation. After Rwanda, many perpetrators fled to neighboring countries in Europe. They integrated into new societies. Some were eventually tracked down and prosecuted. Others never faced consequences. Justice delayed is justice denied, but tracking down war criminals decades after their crimes is better than nothing. Nazi hunters pursued Holocaust perpetrators well into the 21st century. Some were found in their 90s, finally facing trial for crimes committed when they were young men. Does prosecuting a 95-year-old man accomplish anything? Survivors say yes. Justice matters even when it's delayed. The International Criminal Court was created to address this problem systematically. Established in 2002, it's supposed to prosecute individuals for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. But it faces massive challenges. First, it only has jurisdiction when national courts can't or won't prosecute. Second, it relies entirely on member states to arrest suspects. The ICC has no police force. If a country refuses to hand someone over, the court can't do anything about it. Omar al-Bashir, former president of Sudan, was indicted for genocide in Darfur. He traveled to multiple ICC member states afterward, and none arrested him. The court issued warrants, but couldn't enforce them. America isn't even a member of the ICC. Neither is Russia, China, or India. This means the court can't prosecute their nationals unless crimes occur in member states. The U.S. actually passed a law authorizing military force to free any American held by the ICC. Critics call it the Hague Invasion Act. So the court designed to hold powerful people accountable has no power over the most powerful countries. It ends up prosecuting mostly African leaders, which creates the perception that it's a tool of Western neocolonialism. Fair or not, that perception undermines its legitimacy. Prosecution isn't the only form of accountability. Truth commissions offer an alternative approach. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission allowed perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes to testify about their actions in exchange for amnesty. The goal wasn't punishment, but acknowledgement. Victims wanted to know what happened to their loved ones. They wanted perpetrators to admit what they'd done. Some found this process healing. Others felt betrayed by the lack of punishment. There's no single answer to what justice looks like. Rwanda took a completely different approach after the genocide. They had to prosecute hundreds of thousands of people. The formal court system couldn't handle it, so they revived Gacaca courts, traditional community-based justice. Perpetrators confessed in front of survivors and community members. Those who confessed fully received reduced sentences. The process was imperfect and sometimes allowed false confessions or score settling, but it processed cases that would have taken centuries in formal courts. Justice had to be balanced against practical reality. Some argue that focusing on individual prosecutions misses the point. War crimes don't happen because a few bad people make evil choices. They happen because systems and structures enable them. Military hierarchies that punish dissent, societies that dehumanize certain groups, economic systems that make violence profitable. Prosecuting individuals might provide symbolic justice, but it doesn't dismantle the conditions that made their crimes possible. This perspective suggests we need systemic change, not just criminal trials. But here's the counter-argument. Individuals still make choices. Soldiers in the same unit, faced with the same orders, don't all commit atrocities. Some refuse. Some report abuses. Some risk their own safety to protect civilians. If circumstances alone determine behavior, we wouldn't see this variation. Holding individuals accountable affirms that choices matter. It sends a message that following orders isn't an excuse. That being at war doesn't mean anything goes. The concept of universal jurisdiction allows any country to prosecute certain crimes, regardless of where they occurred, or the nationality of perpetrators. The idea is that some crimes are so severe, they concern all of humanity. Spain used universal jurisdiction to indict Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in 1998. He was arrested in London and fought extradition for months before being released on medical grounds. He never faced trial, but the case established that former heads of state aren't automatically immune from prosecution. Belgium had aggressive universal jurisdiction laws and became a destination for war crimes, complaints from around the world. Then the U.S. threatened to move NATO headquarters out of Brussels if Belgium didn't change its laws. Belgium backed down. This shows how universal jurisdiction sounds good in theory, but faces political obstacles in practice. Powerful countries won't let their officials be prosecuted by foreign courts. Witness protection is a massive challenge in war crimes trials. Witnesses often live in the same communities as perpetrators or their supporters. Testifying can be a death sentence. International courts relocate some witnesses, but they can't protect everyone. In the former Yugoslavia, witnesses were intimidated and killed. Some recanted testimony out of fear. Without witnesses willing to testify, prosecutions collapse. Evidence collection in war zones is incredibly difficult. Crime scenes are active combat areas. Evidence degrades or gets destroyed. Documentation might not exist or might have been deliberately destroyed. Forensic teams can't access sites for years. By the time investigators arrive, evidence is compromised. Mass graves get disturbed. Witnesses' memories fade or become unreliable. Building cases beyond reasonable doubt becomes nearly impossible. Digital evidence has changed war crimes documentation. Smartphones and social media mean atrocities get recorded and shared instantly. Syrian civilians documented chemical weapons attacks. Ukrainian citizens recorded Russian military movements. This creates unprecedented amounts of evidence, but it also creates problems. How do you verify authenticity? How do you establish chain of custody for a video uploaded anonymously? Defense lawyers challenge digital evidence as potentially manipulated. Courts are still figuring out how to handle this new reality. Satellite imagery provides another evidence source. Researchers can track village destruction, mass grave sites, and troop movements from space. Before and after images show what happened in areas where access is impossible. But satellite evidence has limitations. It shows what happened, but not who did it or why. It's supporting evidence, not standalone proof. The trauma impact on investigators and prosecutors doesn't get discussed enough. People who work on war crimes cases spend years immersed in humanity's worst moments. They watch execution videos. They interview torture survivors. They examine forensic evidence from mass graves. Many develop PTSD or depression. Some become cynical or numb. The psychological cost of pursuing justice is enormous and often invisible. Defense attorneys in war crimes trials face unique challenges too. Everyone assumes their clients are guilty. They receive death threats. But robust defense is essential for legitimate trials. If defendants don't get fair representation, convictions get overturned on appeal. Some defense lawyers genuinely believe in their client's innocence. Others believe everyone deserves a defense regardless of what they've done. The work is thankless and often dangerous. Victim participation in trials varies by jurisdiction. Some courts allow victims to testify about impact. Others limit victim involvement to witnesses of specific incidents. The ICC has victim participation mechanisms, but they're controversial. Some argue victims deserve a voice beyond being witnesses. Others worry that victim participation turns trials into revenge proceedings rather than neutral justice. Balancing these concerns is difficult. Reparations for war crimes, victims are rarely adequate. Courts can order compensation, but collecting it is another matter. Convicted war criminals usually don't have assets to seize. States might owe reparations, but refuse to pay. Victims end up with symbolic judgments, but no actual compensation. Some countries establish victim trust funds, but the money never comes close to making victims whole. How do you compensate someone for losing their entire family? For years of torture? For being forced to commit atrocities themselves? Child soldiers present particularly difficult questions. Their victims forced or manipulated into fighting. But they also commit terrible crimes. Should they be prosecuted? The Rome Statute says the ICC can't prosecute anyone under 18 when crimes occurred, but national courts sometimes do. Uganda prosecuted former child soldiers as adults. Critics argued this punished victims. Supporters said some former child soldiers committed atrocities as young adults and needed accountability. Where do you draw the line? Sexual violence as a weapon of war finally got recognized as a distinct crime category. For decades, it was treated as inevitable collateral damage. The Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals explicitly prosecuted sexual violence as genocide and crimes against humanity. This recognition matters because it acknowledges the systematic nature of rape in conflict. It's not undisciplined soldiers acting on impulse. It's deliberate strategy to terrorize and destroy communities. The stigma survivors face often exceeds the physical harm. Women who were raped get rejected by their families and communities. Children born of rape face lifelong discrimination. Survivors might not testify because doing so means revealing what happened to them. The shame attached to sexual violence silences victims and protects perpetrators. Some cultures are starting to shift this burden from survivors to perpetrators, but it's slow progress. Enforcing sentences is yet another problem. The ICC has no prison. Convicted individuals serve sentences in volunteer member state prisons. If no country volunteers, there's nowhere to send them. Some war criminals serve time in comfortable European prisons with better conditions than law-abiding citizens in their home countries. This creates uncomfortable optics. The person who ordered massacres gets 3 meals a day and medical care while his victims struggle to survive. Early release is common. Sentences get reduced for good behavior or cooperation. War criminals serve a fraction of their terms. Some get released after just years for crimes that destroyed thousands of lives. Survivors watch perpetrators walk free while they're still dealing with trauma decades later. The gap between what justice promises and what it delivers can be devastating. Amnesties complicate everything. Peace negotiations often include amnesty provisions to convince armed groups to lay down weapons. Uganda offered amnesty to Lord's Resistance Army commanders to end decades of conflict. Colombia gave reduced sentences to FARC rebels who confessed. These deals prioritize peace over justice, but they leave victims feeling abandoned. Is ending violence worth letting perpetrators escape punishment? There's no easy answer. Truth commissions offer an alternative to trials. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission became the model. Perpetrators could confess crimes publicly in exchange for amnesty. The idea was that truth-telling would facilitate healing. Victims would learn what happened to their loved ones. Society would acknowledge the harm done. But did it work? Opinions are divided. Some victims found closure through hearing confessions. Others felt betrayed, watching murderers walk free. The commission documented atrocities that might otherwise have been denied, but it couldn't prosecute anyone. Justice took a back seat to reconciliation. Whether that trade-off was worth it depends on who you ask. Sierra Leone tried a hybrid approach. They ran both a war crimes tribunal and a truth commission simultaneously. The tribunal prosecuted leaders, while the commission offered a platform for lower-level perpetrators and victims. This dual system attempted to balance accountability with healing. It was messy in practice. Some witnesses testified at both venues, reliving trauma repeatedly. The tribunal and commission sometimes worked at cross purposes, but the experiment showed that justice doesn't have to be all or nothing. Different mechanisms can address different needs. Customary justice systems get overlooked in these discussions. Many communities have traditional conflict resolution methods that predate Western legal systems. Rwanda used Gacaca courts after the genocide. These community-based tribunals handled lower-level perpetrators. Defendants faced their neighbors in open proceedings. The goal was reintegrating offenders into society rather than permanent punishment. Critics worried about vigilante justice and inadequate due process. Supporters argued it was more culturally appropriate than Western courts and actually dealt with the massive number of cases. Over 1 million cases went through Gacaca courts. No international tribunal could have handled that volume. Indigenous justice practices often prioritize restoration over retribution. The focus is healing relationships rather than punishing individuals. Offenders must acknowledge harm and make amends. Communities decide appropriate responses collectively. This approach seems foreign to Western legal minds, trained to think in terms of guilt and punishment, but it might address some gaps that formal justice systems miss. The question is whether serious war crimes can be handled through restorative processes. Can you restore a relationship with someone who massacred your family? Maybe not. But for lesser crimes or community-wide harms, these approaches might work better than courts ever could. Memorialization is another form of justice that doesn't involve trials. Building museums, monuments, and archives ensures atrocities aren't forgotten. The Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda preserves evidence and honors victims. The Holocaust has thousands of memorials worldwide. These spaces serve multiple purposes. They educate future generations. They provide places for survivors to mourn. They make denial harder by creating permanent records. But memorials can also become political tools. Governments might use them to craft narratives that serve current agendas rather than historical accuracy. Who decides what gets remembered and how? The way we memorialize shapes how we understand what happened. Documentation itself is a justice mechanism. Recording testimony preserves evidence for future prosecutions or historical record. Organizations conduct oral history projects with survivors. They collect documents, photographs, and physical evidence. This work matters even if trials never happen. It creates an archive that counters denial and revisionism. Decades later, historians can access these materials. Survivors' voices get preserved. The truth becomes harder to erase. But documentation also raises ethical questions. Repeatedly interviewing traumatized people can re-traumatize them. Whose benefit is this for? The survivor or the historical record? How do we balance these interests? Reparations programs attempt to provide material compensation. Germany paid billions to Holocaust survivors and victim families. Some survived on these payments. Others rejected them, saying no amount of money could compensate for what was taken. Reparations send a message that society acknowledges the harm and takes responsibility, but they're complicated to implement. Who qualifies as a victim? How do you calculate appropriate amounts? What about indirect victims or trauma passed through generations? And where does the money come from? Taxing current citizens to pay for past crimes creates resentment, especially if those citizens weren't alive when crimes occurred. Corporate accountability is emerging as a new frontier. Companies that profited from atrocities face lawsuits and investigations. Firms that used slave labor during conflicts. Banks that handled stolen assets. Arms manufacturers that sold weapons knowing they'd be used against civilians. Holding corporations accountable is difficult. They have resources to fight legal battles. They operate across borders. They restructure to avoid liability. But some progress is happening. Courts have awarded damages against companies. Naming and shaming creates reputational costs. Shareholders pressure firms to address past wrongs. It's slow, but the idea that corporations can't profit from atrocities with impunity is gaining traction. Sanctions serve as punishment when prosecution isn't possible. The UN and individual countries impose travel bans and asset freezes on suspected war criminals. These measures isolate perpetrators and signal disapproval. They're easier to implement than arrests. You don't need custody of someone to freeze their bank accounts, but sanctions have limitations. Wealthy war criminals hide assets through shell companies. They don't travel to countries enforcing bans anyway. And sanctions sometimes hurt civilian populations more than targeted leaders. Iraq sanctions in the 90s contributed to humanitarian crisis while Saddam Hussein remained comfortable. The gap between intention and effect can be enormous. Universal jurisdiction allows countries to prosecute war crimes committed anywhere by anyone. Belgian courts tried Rwandan genocide perpetrators. Spanish judges investigated Argentine military leaders. This principle says some crimes are so heinous that any country can prosecute them. It expands accountability options when perpetrators' home countries won't act. But it's controversial. Critics call it judicial imperialism. They worry about politically motivated prosecutions. What stops powerful countries from using universal jurisdiction against weaker nations while protecting their own? The principle is applied inconsistently. Western countries prosecute African war criminals under universal jurisdiction, but rarely apply it to Western suspects. Vetting and lustration remove perpetrators from positions of power. After conflicts, officials who committed abuses might remain in government or military. Vetting processes screen them out. Police, judges, and civil servants undergo background checks. Those with human rights violations get dismissed. This prevents former abusers from continuing to wield authority. It also sends a message that past conduct has consequences. But vetting is politically difficult. It removes experienced officials. It creates backlash from those dismissed, and it requires information that might not exist. If records were destroyed or never kept, how do you identify perpetrators? Mistakes happen. Innocent people get caught up while guilty ones slip through. Institutional reform addresses systems that enabled atrocities, disbanding abusive security forces, rewriting laws that discriminated against groups, reforming education to counter propaganda. These changes try to prevent recurrence. They acknowledge that individual prosecutions aren't enough if the system that produced war criminals remains intact. Guatemala reformed its military after civil war. Bosnia restructured police forces. But reform faces resistance from entrenched interests. Those who benefited from old systems fight to preserve them. Reform also takes time. Decades might pass before changes take root. Meanwhile, new abuses can occur. Exile is an old solution making comebacks. Some war criminals flee to countries that won't extradite them. They live freely, but can't return home. It's partial accountability. They escape prison but lose their country. Some argue this is too lenient. Others say it's pragmatic. If the alternative is continued violence because the perpetrator won't surrender, maybe exile is acceptable. Idi Amin lived in Saudi Arabia until he died. Charles Taylor is in prison, but some of his allies fled to other African countries. Exile ends their direct involvement, but doesn't deliver justice to victims. It's unsatisfying, but sometimes necessary. The role of apologies deserves attention. Official acknowledgments of wrongdoing matter to victims. When governments or institutions apologize, they validate victims' experiences. They accept responsibility. Canada apologized to Indigenous peoples for residential schools. Australia apologized to Aboriginal communities for forced removals. These apologies don't undo harm, but they represent recognition. However, apologies without action ring hollow. If you apologize but don't change policies or provide reparations, what's the point? Victims see through performative apologies designed to generate positive press without real commitment. Generational trauma complicates everything. The children and grandchildren of atrocity survivors carry psychological wounds. Studies show trauma affects passing through DNA. Communities remain fractured decades after violence ends. Justice mechanisms rarely address this ongoing harm. Courts handle crimes, not intergenerational consequences. But ignoring long-term impacts means justice remains incomplete. How do you heal communities where everyone is traumatized, where trust is destroyed, where normal social bonds don't exist? These questions don't have legal answers. The politics of timing matter enormously. Justice pursued immediately after conflict might destabilize fragile peace. Waiting decades means victims die without seeing accountability. There's never a perfect time. Kenya delayed addressing post-election violence, and cases eventually collapsed. Rwanda moved quickly with Gacaca courts while memories were fresh. Each approach has trade-offs. Act too soon, and you risk renewed violence. Wait too long, and evidence disappears. The political calculation is brutal. Leaders must weigh justice against stability, knowing either choice leaves people suffering. International justice also reflects power imbalances. The ICC has primarily prosecuted African leaders. Critics call it biased. Defenders say that's where referrals came from. But the pattern is undeniable. Western powers commit abuses with relative impunity. The U.S. invaded Iraq based on false premises. Israel faces accusations regarding Palestinians. Myanmar's military attacks Rohingya. China detains Uyghurs. These situations rarely result in ICC cases. The court lacks power to compel investigations against countries that reject its jurisdiction. Justice ends up being something powerful countries impose on weaker ones, rather than a universal principle. The question of collective guilt versus individual responsibility persists. Should entire ethnic groups or nations bear responsibility for atrocities some members committed? Germany grappled with this after World War II. How do you hold a society accountable without punishing people who weren't involved? The answer involves education, memorialization, and institutional reform rather than prosecuting everyone. But tensions remain. Descendants of perpetrators sometimes feel unfairly blamed. Descendants of victims feel their suffering gets minimized. Finding balance between acknowledging collective responsibility and avoiding collective punishment is delicate work. Memory itself becomes a battleground. Who gets to define what happened? Official histories often sanitize atrocities. Governments rewrite textbooks. Museums present selective narratives. Turkey denies the Armenian genocide. Japan minimizes wartime atrocities in textbooks. Russia rewrites Soviet history. These aren't just academic disputes. They're attempts to control how future generations understand the past. When you erase atrocities from memory, you make them easier to repeat. Education becomes a justice tool. Teaching accurate history prevents denial. But who decides what's accurate? Victors write history, as the saying goes. Even well-intentioned educators face pressure to present palatable versions of events. American textbooks downplay slavery's brutality. British schools gloss over colonial violence. Every country has blind spots regarding its own history. Victims demand their stories be told fully and honestly. Perpetrators or their descendants want to move on. The tension never fully resolves. Digital technology changes documentation dramatically. Smartphones capture atrocities in real time. Social media spreads evidence globally within hours. Syria's civil war was documented more thoroughly than any previous conflict. Citizens filmed barrel bombs, chemical attacks, executions. This footage becomes evidence for future prosecutions. It also traumatizes viewers worldwide. The constant stream of atrocity images creates numbness. We scroll past horrors that would have dominated headlines for weeks in earlier eras. Technology makes hiding crimes harder, but also makes caring about them harder. When everything is documented, nothing feels urgent. Reparations remain deeply controversial. Should descendants of victims receive payment from descendants of perpetrators? Germany paid reparations to Holocaust survivors in Israel. The U.S. government paid Japanese Americans interned during World War II. These programs acknowledge that financial harm occurred alongside physical and psychological harm. But calculating appropriate amounts is impossible. How do you price mass murder? Torture? Cultural destruction? Any number seems inadequate. Yet offering nothing suggests the harm didn't matter. Caribbean nations have demanded reparations from European countries for slavery. The amounts discussed reach trillions of dollars. Former colonial powers resist, arguing current citizens shouldn't pay for ancestors' crimes. Victims' descendants argue the wealth built on slavery still benefits those countries today. Both sides have points. The debate will continue for generations. Private justice complicates official processes. Families of victims sometimes pursue their own accountability when states fail. This ranges from civil lawsuits to vigilante violence. After Argentina's military junta fell, some families tracked down torturers living freely and exposed them publicly. Others pursued civil cases when criminal prosecution wasn't possible. In rare cases, victims or their relatives killed perpetrators. These actions are understandable but problematic. They operate outside legal frameworks. They risk sparking cycles of revenge. But when official justice fails completely, can you blame people for acting independently? The moral calculation isn't simple. We condemn vigilante justice in stable democracies, but post-atrocity societies aren't stable democracies. Normal rules don't apply neatly. The role of witnesses deserves more attention. People who saw atrocities but didn't participate face their own moral reckoning. Did they have an obligation to intervene? To report what they saw? Bystanders often faced genuine danger if they acted, but some witnesses simply chose not to get involved. Years later, they carry guilt. Some become crucial witnesses in trials. Others remain silent. The pressure on witnesses is immense. Testifying means reliving trauma. It means potential retaliation from perpetrator communities. It means being cross-examined by defense lawyers who will attack your credibility. Many choose silence instead. Justice systems need witnesses, but often fail to protect them adequately. Witness protection programs exist, but are expensive and imperfect. Relocated witnesses lose their communities and identities. The cost of participating in justice processes can be devastating. Forgiveness gets discussed as though it's simple. Religious and political leaders urge victims to forgive perpetrators. They frame forgiveness as healing. But forgiveness isn't a light switch. It's a complex psychological process that many victims never complete. And that's okay. Nobody is obligated to forgive people who destroyed their lives. Pressure to forgive adds another burden to victims. It suggests they're being difficult or vengeful if they can't let go. Some victims do forgive and report finding peace. Others remain angry until they die. Both responses are valid. Justice processes shouldn't require forgiveness. They should focus on accountability regardless of whether victims forgive. The two are separate issues. Perpetrators can be held accountable whether victims forgive them or not. Victims can choose forgiveness regardless of whether perpetrators face justice. Conflating the two creates false expectations. The economics of justice matter more than people acknowledge. Tribunals cost billions. The Yugoslavia Tribunal spent over $2 billion across 2 decades. That money came from international donors who could have spent it on aid, development, or health care. Was it worth it? Supporters say justice has intrinsic value beyond economics. Critics argue those resources could have helped more people if spent differently. Poor countries facing atrocities often can't afford robust justice systems. They depend on international support that may or may not materialize. Wealthy countries can pursue justice more effectively. This creates inequality. Rich countries get thorough investigations and trials. Poor countries get overwhelmed local courts that can't handle the caseload. The disparity reinforces global hierarchies where some victims matter more than others. Mental health support for everyone involved is almost always inadequate. Victims need therapy to process trauma. Perpetrators who genuinely feel remorse need help understanding what they did. Judges and lawyers suffer vicarious trauma from hearing testimony daily. None of these groups receive sufficient mental health resources. Trials proceed without addressing psychological needs. Victims testify without preparation for the emotional impact. Perpetrators express remorse without guidance on processing guilt. The system treats people as legal actors rather than humans with complex emotional needs. Adding comprehensive mental health support would improve outcomes, but requires resources and expertise often unavailable. Children born of rape during atrocities face unique challenges. They're living reminders of violence. Some mothers love these children, others can't bond with them. Communities sometimes reject them. Should justice processes address their needs? They're victims who committed no crime but carry stigma. Rwanda has thousands of children born from rapes during the genocide. Bosnia has similar populations. These children grow up knowing their origins. They struggle with identity. Are they members of their mother's community or their father's? Neither group fully accepts them. Programs supporting these children exist, but are underfunded. Their existence complicates neat narratives about justice and healing. They embody ongoing harm that can't be prosecuted or resolved through trials. The definition of victim isn't always clear. Obviously, people who were killed, tortured, or raped are victims. But what about people displaced who lost property? People who witnessed atrocities but weren't directly harmed physically? People who lost family members? Children orphaned by violence? Entire communities traumatized? Where do you draw the line? Broad definitions mean more people deserve recognition and compensation. Narrow definitions make programs manageable. Legal systems typically focus on direct victims. But atrocities create ripples affecting thousands more people than those directly targeted. Ignoring indirect victims means failing to address the full scope of harm. Including everyone makes justice systems unmanageable. There's no perfect answer. Historical distance changes everything. Events from centuries ago feel different than recent atrocities. We view slavery as horrific, but don't demand trials for slaveholders' descendants. The Holocaust happened within living memory, so it feels more urgent. Where's the cutoff? At what point do atrocities become historical rather than actionable? Some argue there shouldn't be a statute of limitations on mass atrocities. Others say practical realities require focusing on recent events. Evidence degrades over time. Witnesses die. Societies change. Pursuing justice for events from 200 years ago seems pointless to some, essential to others. Indigenous communities argue colonization's effects persist today, making it contemporary rather than historical. The debate reflects different understandings of time and justice. So what does all of this tell us? After examining countless atrocities across centuries, one truth emerges. War crimes aren't aberrations, they're patterns. They happen because humans under pressure, given power, and stripped of accountability, will cross lines they never imagined crossing. The systems we've built to prevent this keep failing not because they're poorly designed, but because they challenge something fundamental about how power operates. Justice for atrocities remains selective, delayed, and incomplete. Yet the alternative is accepting that might makes right and that victims don't matter. We keep trying because the cost of not trying is abandoning the idea that some acts are universally wrong. That's a line we can't uncross.